The chance to calm down. When I got that new one back, I stayed quiet.
Franchise, also game time.
I done about 3 in Chicago, where I grew up at.
Nobody expected a draft party to turn into a coronation, but that's exactly what happened the moment Shedeur Sanders walked through that door, and nothing in that room was ever the same again. The energy didn't just shift, it exploded. Fans who had been casually watching a Browns draft event suddenly forgot everything else that was happening around them. Phones flew up in the air, voices got louder, and people started pushing toward one single direction. And the wildest part? Shedeur didn't even have to do anything. He just walked in. That's the kind of presence that can't be faked, can't be taught, and definitely can't be ignored. So before we get into what this all means for his future in Cleveland, ask yourself this. When was the last time a fifth-round pick shut down an entire draft party just by showing up? Because what happened that night wasn't normal, not even close. And by the time this story is done, you'll understand exactly why the people who counted him out are now the quietest ones in the room. The moment Shedeur stepped inside that building, something changed in the air. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't slow, it was instant, like a switch being flipped in a room that was already buzzing. People turned their heads at the exact same time, almost like they sensed something big had entered the space before they even saw him. And then the phones went up. Every single one of them. People stopped mid-conversation, stopped watching the draft coverage on the screens, stopped doing whatever they were doing, and locked their eyes on one person. He walked in. Calm, completely calm, smiling, relaxed, fully aware of every eye in the room landing on him, but not rattled by a single second of it. That kind of composure in a moment that loud says everything. Most people would tense up, most people would rush through it or look uncomfortable. Shedeur moved through it like he'd been there 1,000 times before, like the attention was just background noise he already knew how to handle. And the crowd felt that. They didn't just react to his name or his face, they reacted to the energy he brought into the room. That mix of calm and fire, of confidence without arrogance, hit the entire place like a wave. Fans started pushing from all sides, not violently, but with that kind of desperate energy that comes when people feel like they're watching something rare and they don't want to miss their shot to be part of it. Jerseys were being held up, pens were being extended from every direction, people were calling his name over each other, overlapping voices turning into a wall of sound. And Shedeur stood right in the middle of it all, not pulling away, not rushing through it, just staying there, signing, acknowledging people, nodding, giving every fan a moment. That patience in the middle of chaos is what made the scene even more powerful, because it wasn't just a celebrity sighting, it felt like a statement. Like someone walking into a room and making it very clear, without saying a single word, that they belong here, that they've already arrived. And everyone in that building, from the fans screaming at the front to the front office watching from the side, felt exactly that. The chaos around Shedeur at that draft party wasn't just a cool moment for social media, it was a signal. And the Browns front office didn't miss it. Because when Cleveland stepped to the clock on draft night, the moves they made told a very specific story. It wasn't random, it wasn't just filling roster needs, it was construction, deliberate, calculated, and pointed directly at one quarterback's future. With the 9th overall pick, the Browns selected Spencer Fenoti, an offensive tackle out of USC. 6'6", 311 pounds, and built like an actual wall. But here's the thing about Fenoti that makes him dangerous beyond just his size. He moves. Fast feet, clean balance, and the kind of technique that lets him shift between left tackle and right tackle without missing a step. College tape on this man was relentless. Analysts couldn't stop talking about him. One of them put it plainly during coverage, saying he gave up 0 sacks across hundreds of pass protection reps and moves with the fluidity of a tight end trapped inside a lineman's frame. That's not just a compliment, that's a declaration. Because when you protect a quarterback that well, you're not just keeping him upright, you're giving him time to think, time to read the field, time to be great. And if the plan is to put Shedeur Sanders under center and let him operate, then surrounding him with that kind of protection first is the loudest possible message the organization could send. This wasn't a pick made for depth, this was a pick made for a reason, and that reason had a name attached to it the moment the card was handed in. But the Browns weren't finished, not even close, because the very next significant move made the picture even clearer. With the 24th pick, Cleveland grabbed KC Contraception out of Texas A&M, a receiver who doesn't just run routes, he breaks coverage like it owes him something. 61 catches, 919 yards, 9 touchdowns in 2025. Those are not quiet numbers. That's a player who was dominant in space, who understands how to create separation against tight man coverage, and who turns the smallest windows into massive gains because his football IQ matches his physical ability. Fans didn't need an analyst to explain this one. The reaction was immediate. People started connecting the dots out loud in real time, saying that this pairing with Shedeur was going to be something special. And they weren't wrong to feel that way, because the connection between these two players is almost too obvious once you see it. One quarterback who thrives when defenders are pressed up close because his release is fast and his reads are sharp. One receiver specifically built to destroy that exact coverage. Put those two on the same field, and defensive coordinators have a serious problem on their hands. That's not coincidence, that's design. And the more you look at the full picture of what Cleveland built in that draft, the harder it becomes to call any of it random. The offensive line reinforced, a dynamic receiver added with the range and skill set that complements a quarterback who plays with precision and speed. Every piece fits, every move connects back to one central idea: build the offense around the guy who just shut down an entire draft party by walking through the door. By the time the second day of the draft wrapped up, the pattern wasn't just visible, it was impossible to ignore. Every major move the Browns made traced back to the same central point: Shedeur Sanders. The offensive line protection, the separation receiver, the overall philosophy behind the picks, all of it pointed toward building something specific around a quarterback who hadn't even taken a regular season snap yet. And analysts started catching up to what fans had already been saying for days. The tone in football circles began shifting. Comments that had been cautious or skeptical started sounding more like acknowledgement. Voices that had been slow to commit started saying things out loud like, "This is exactly how you build around a young quarterback stepping into a serious role." Because it is. When a front office drafts your blindside protector before they draft your weapons, that's a statement of priority. When they follow it up by grabbing a receiver with the exact skill set that makes your quarterback's game look unstoppable, that's not depth building, that's preparation. That's an organization saying, quietly but clearly, we know who our guy is, and we are getting him everything he needs before the first game is even played. Fans felt it immediately. Social media was already running with the Shedeur and Concepcion pairing before the ink was dry on the draft board, people calling it a nightmare matchup for defenses. Defensive backs who press at the line are already in trouble against a receiver who can release cleanly and separate with ease. Add a quarterback who processes fast and delivers on time, and suddenly that combination becomes one of the more dangerous ones in the entire conference. And with Finotti anchoring the edge and keeping the pocket clean, the whole structure starts to look less like a rebuilding project and more like a launching pad. Cleveland wasn't drafting for next year, they were drafting for now. For a future that already had a face, already had a name, and was already filling rooms with energy before the season even started. The story that was forming wasn't subtle. It was a team making its intentions known through actions, not words, and those actions were all pointing in the same direction. But to understand why this moment hit so differently, why it landed with so much weight, you have to go back. You have to go back to where this story actually started. Because the version of Shedeur Sanders standing calmly in the middle of that chaotic draft party, the one being drafted into an offense built specifically around his strengths, didn't derive here easily. He came through something, and what he came through would have broken most people. Not long before any of this, Shedeur Sanders was not being talked about as a future centerpiece. He was being questioned at every single level. His talent, his attitude, his ability to handle pressure, his fit in a professional system, everything was on the table and being picked apart. The doubt wasn't quiet either. It was loud, it was public, and a significant portion of it crossed lines that had nothing to do with football at all. Racism surfaced in discussions around him. Ugly talk that had no place in any evaluation of any athlete. He was being targeted not just as a prospect, but as a person, and the attacks came from multiple directions at once. And then draft night arrived, and instead of silencing the noise, it made it worse. Reports had been circulating that teams like the New Orleans Saints had genuine interest. There were signals, conversations, indications that he might go earlier than expected. Fans were watching, expectations had been building. And then the picks came and went, and Shedeur's name wasn't called. Not in the first round, not in the second, not in the third, not even in the fourth. He sat and waited through all of it until the fifth round finally brought Cleveland to the phone. Fifth round, for a quarterback who put up some of the most efficient numbers in college football, for a player who by almost any statistical measure had done everything asked of him at the collegiate level. That kind of drop doesn't happen quietly. It creates noise, it creates speculation, it creates a very uncomfortable feeling that something happened behind the scenes that had nothing to do with football ability and everything to do with politics, perception, and the kind of bias that the league has always struggled to address honestly. And when he finally landed in Cleveland, the situation didn't suddenly become manageable. It became more complicated, because instead of walking into a clear opportunity, Shedeur was dropped into a crowded and confusing quarterback room where the path forward was anything but obvious. The situation inside the Browns' quarterback room was not set up to make things easy. Reports coming out of the facility painted a picture of a competition that wasn't entirely balanced. Shedeur was in the building, but the reps weren't flowing freely in his direction. Dylan Gabriel was getting looks, more looks than many observers felt were justified given the talent sitting right next to him on the depth chart. And that imbalance created friction, not just between players, but between the fan base and the coaching staff. Questions started building around Kevin Stefanski almost immediately. Why wasn't Shedeur being pushed to the front? Why was a fifth-round pick with a college resume that serious being treated like a development project instead of a real competition? The frustration wasn't just casual fan noise, it was specific, pointed, and growing louder by the week. People who had watched Shedeur play, who had seen what he could do when given a proper supporting cast and a real opportunity to operate, couldn't understand what was taking so long. The coaching decisions felt slow, the process felt deliberate in a way that didn't sit well with people who had been watching this situation from the outside. And the media didn't stay quiet either. Names like Mary Kay Cabot, Jason Lloyd, Anthony Lima, Tony Grossi, and Emmanuel Acho became regular voices in the ongoing conversation surrounding Shedeur's status in Cleveland. Some of the coverage was measured, some of it was critical, some of it went further than that and added fuel to a fire that was already burning hot. The combination of limited reps, a crowded room, coaching decisions that raised eyebrows, and media takes that weren't always fair created a pressure cooker situation around a young quarterback who hadn't even been given a full chance to prove himself yet. Most players would have cracked under that weight. Most people would have internalized the doubt, started questioning themselves, starting letting the outside noise creep into the inside space where confidence lives. Shedeur didn't do that. He stayed ready. He stayed locked in. He kept training, kept building, kept showing up with the same energy day after day regardless of what was being said about him in studios and comment sections in meeting rooms. And that consistency, that refusal to break under pressure that was coming from every direction at once is what started to slowly change the conversation.
Because here's what the doubters didn't account for. They assumed the noise would eventually wear him down. They assumed that a fifth-round drop, a crowded depth chart, limited reps, public criticism, and a media environment that wasn't always in his corner would add up to a player who faded into the background. That's usually how it goes. That's the outcome the math was pointing toward. But Shedeur Sanders didn't follow the math. He stayed present when everything around him was designed to push him toward the exit, and as the weeks went by, something started to shift in the way people talked about him. The fans who had been defending him started sounding less like they were fighting against the current and more like they were watching something real take shape. The support got louder, the energy around his name got heavier, and slowly the tone in football circles began to change from skepticism to something closer to acknowledgement. People started noticing things they hadn't been willing to notice before. The way he carried himself in practice settings, the way he processed information under pressure, the way he commanded attention in a room without demanding it. These are not things you can manufacture. These are not skills that show up in a combine drill or a 40-yard dash time. These are the things that separate quarterbacks who can play from quarterbacks who can lead. And Shedeur was showing both, quietly, consistently, every single day, even when no one with a camera was pointing in his direction. That kind of work ethic doesn't announce itself, it just builds. And by the time the draft party happened, by the time he walked into that room and the entire energy of the building shifted in an instant, the foundation had already been laid through months of showing up when it would have been easier to disappear. The moment at the party wasn't the beginning of his story, it was the visible result of everything that had been happening under the surface for a long time. And now the people who spent months building the case against him are in a very uncomfortable position, because the narrative they pushed, the one that said Shedeur Sanders wasn't ready, wasn't the right fit, wasn't worth the investment, isn't holding up, not even a little bit. Dillon Gabriel was supposed to be the answer to the question they kept asking. He was supposed to be the safe choice, the experienced option, the reason the Browns wouldn't need to fully commit to the fifth-round pick from Colorado. That story fell apart. Gabriel's presence in the offseason has been barely noticeable, no real noise coming from his direction, no grind visible to the outside, no chemistry being built, no momentum being generated. Just silence in a competition that required volume. Meanwhile, Shedeur was doing the opposite of disappearing. He was training, building, connecting, and showing up in every space where presence matters. That kind of contrast is brutal for anyone who staked their credibility on the Gabriel narrative. When one player fades and the other doubles down and takes over the room, literally and figuratively, the argument doesn't just lose, it collapses. And the receiver room had its own version of this tension. Jerry Jeudy's situation became part of the conversation in a way that wasn't flattering. Reports and fan discussions suggested there was friction, that Jeudy was not fully locked in with the direction the team was heading, that his spot was becoming shakier with every day that the roster continued to take its new identity around a different identity. The energy Jeudy tried to bring against Shedeur's rise in the public conversation started bouncing back in his direction. Because when a front office begins building an offense around a specific quarterback, anyone who positions themselves against that movement becomes the problem. It's that simple. The question stops being about who's been there longer or who has more experience. The question becomes who fits the vision. And right now, the vision in Cleveland has a very specific face attached to it. Jeudy's situation isn't resolved, his spot isn't guaranteed, and the pressure that was supposed to be sitting on Shedeur's shoulders has quietly moved across the room to a completely different address. And then there's Kevin Stefanski, the coach who was at the center of so much of the frustration during Shedeur's early days in Cleveland, the man whose decisions around the quarterback room raised so many questions, whose handling of the competition felt unbalanced to so many people watching from the outside. That chapter is closed now. Stefanski was let go. Cleveland moved on, and he landed in Atlanta with the Falcons, which on paper looked like a fresh start, a new city, a new roster, a new chance to do things differently. But patterns are stubborn, and the same energy that created problems in Cleveland is reportedly starting to generate noise in Atlanta. Fans aren't fully bought in, the locker room dynamics are being watched carefully, the seat is warming up again, and the season hasn't even started. There's something almost poetic about it. The coach who couldn't figure out how to properly utilize one of the most naturally talented young quarterbacks in the draft is now sitting in a different city dealing with familiar questions from a different fan base. Bad decisions don't get left behind when you change your zip code. They follow you, they wait, and sooner or later they show up again wearing a different uniform but carrying the same weight. Cleveland learned that lesson the hard way, and now Atlanta is getting its own introduction to the same curriculum. The football world has a way of connecting these stories across cities and seasons, and right now the thread connecting Stefanski's past to his present is pretty difficult to cut. The media voices that spent months building cases against Shedeur Sanders are now watching those cases fall apart in real time. Mary Kay Cabot, Jason Lloyd, Anthony Lima, Tony Grossi, Emmanuel Acho. These are names that appeared regularly in conversations about why Shedeur wasn't the answer, why the doubt was justified, why Cleveland should be cautious about committing to a fifth-round quarterback with something to prove. Every single one of those takes is aging poorly, not because the criticism itself was always unfair, some of it was legitimate football analysis, but because the underlying assumption behind it was that Shedeur would eventually fold under the pressure, that he would prove the skeptics right not through failure on the field, but through failure of character, failure of work ethic, failure of the kind of quiet resilience that separates players who arrive from players who merely show up. That assumption was wrong, completely wrong. And when you build a narrative around an assumption that turns out to be wrong, the narrative doesn't just fade quietly. It comes back, it gets examined. People start pulling at the threads and asking where the original conclusion came from and whether it was really about football in the first place. That's where some of these voices find themselves right now, defending takes that don't hold up against the evidence of what has actually happened. Shedeur stayed, Shedeur worked, Shedeur built, and the organization didn't just keep him, they restructured their entire draft philosophy around giving him the best possible chance to succeed. That's not the outcome the skeptics scripted, that's the opposite of it. And watching it unfold in real time has created a very specific kind of frustration among people who staked their public credibility on a different ending. The turnaround this story represents goes beyond football, because the version of events that played out, a highly talented quarterback getting slept on in the draft, facing public doubt and private obstacles, dealing with criticism that crossed lines into territory that had nothing to do with his ability, and then quietly outworking every single narrative that was written against him until the organization itself started restructuring to accommodate his future. That's not the sports story. That's a story about what happens when someone refuses to let their environment determine their ceiling. Most people in Shedeur's position during those early Cleveland months would have either forced their way out or slowly faded into the background. He did neither. He stayed locked into a process that wasn't always rewarding him fairly, trusting that the work was building something real, even when the results weren't visible yet. That kind of patience under pressure is rare. It's the thing that separates careers that never fully materialize from careers that become something people talk about for decades. And the Browns, whether they fully recognized it in real time or whether it took the weight of outside evidence to push them toward it, eventually made their choice. They chose to build. They chose to invest. They structured their roster around the belief that the player who walked calmly into that draft party and shut the entire room down without saying a word was exactly the kind of person you build a franchise around. Not just the talent, not just the arm, the presence, the composure, the refusal to become smaller when everything around you is trying to shrink you down. That's what Cleveland drafted when they made those picks. That's what the fans in that room were responding to. That's what every analyst who's slowly shifting their tone is starting to acknowledge, some of them loudly and some of them quietly, and some of them not at all yet, but eventually will. And now here we are, the same player who was dropped to the 5th round while teams reportedly watched and passed, the same player who walked into a crowded quarterback room with limited reps and a media environment that wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat, the same player who dealt with attacks that went beyond football into territory that revealed a lot more about the attackers than about him. That same player is now the centerpiece of a carefully constructed offense. The offensive line was built around protecting him. The receiver room was upgraded specifically with his playing style in mind. The coaching situation that held him back is gone. The competition that was supposed to push him out is fading. And the moment that captured all of it, the one where he walked through the door of that draft party and the entire energy of the building flipped in an instant, is the image that Cleveland is going to be looking back on as the moment it became clear. Not a press conference, not a depth chart announcement, just a player walking into a room and making it obvious without a single word that the conversation had already changed. The haters are not just quiet, they're scrambling. The doubters are not just wrong, they're visibly wrong, publicly wrong in ways that are going to follow their takes for a long time. And Shedeur Sanders isn't standing at a podium making speeches about it. He's just doing what he's been doing through all of it, showing up, staying ready, building something that the people who tried to stop him are now being forced to watch from the outside. What started as a draft party turned into a declaration, and Cleveland felt every single second of it. The question now isn't whether Shedeur belongs. That question already got answered. The question now is just how far this goes. And based on everything that's been built, everything that's been overcome, and everything that walked through that door that night, the answer to that question might be bigger than anyone, even the believers, is ready to admit yet. Subscribe and stay locked, because this story is nowhere near finished.